Hey creative friends, it's Gwen. I'm back today with a scrapbooking process video. Today's share is part of Challenge Me, Challenge You, and I have pulled out some beautiful Maggie Holmes supplies. Today's challenge is vintage photos and chipboard pieces.
Challenge accepted.
I'll also share with you 9 tips for documenting vintage photos. But first, I had some drama with this brand new paper pad. It is the Parasol collection, and the paper pad is not true 12 by 12. It's actually 1/4 inch short. So rather than creating the frame in my usual way, I actually had to just cut some paper strips and layer them around all 4 edges. It worked out okay, and American Crafts are going to send me a refund so that I can go and purchase the true 12 by 12 papers. So part 1 of the challenge is vintage photos, and we will chat about those in a moment. Part 2 was chipboard. I've decided to go with this really pretty filigree piece as well as 4 smaller frames. I'm not a huge fan of painting chipboard, but I do love to emboss it, and this is a really pretty embossing powder. It has flecks of gold and white. As always, I will leave links in the description box below for all of my tools and supplies. This filigree chipboard piece is actually quite large, so I thought it would be best to work section by section to make sure that I get a really nice, good coverage. I'm going to treat the frames in the exact same way, so all of the chipboard that's included on the page will have a consistent look about it. I haven't used chipboard on a project in the longest time, and now I remember why. It's pretty messy and it does take quite a lot of time. Here's the plan for the design. The frames are actually going to create the base, and it's going to run horizontally across the page. While I get those positioned, I did want to share tip number 1 for working with vintage photos, and that is to go with a collection that has a modern vintage feel. You don't need to purchase vintage specific supplies. You can absolutely use what you have, and in fact this is a brand new collection. It's Maggie Holmes Parasol. It just has a modern vintage feel about it. It's here that I realized that I did actually want to back the frames with pattern paper. One mistake down, plenty more to go. They were glued down, and I did actually have to very carefully prise them up off the background there. Professional scrapbooker right here. It's okay, it does all get covered up and no one would ever know. While I fix that, I'll share with you tip number 2. Vintage photos can at times have some pretty wild patterns in them, so we kind of need to, in a way, lean into that a little bit. I really like to document them using a mix of eclectic pieces. The Maggie Holmes collections are particularly good at just doing that naturally, but I think what makes them work the most is the fact that there's so many little bits and pieces of things. Kind of like if you were to go into a vintage store. They have a vibe to them. They have this feeling, and I like to actually try and recreate that feeling on the layout. Tip number 3 is to print your photos in black and white. If you have a photo that has a lot going on in it, if it's got lots of busy patterns, maybe it's a group photo where everyone's wearing a different print, a really good idea is to print those in black and white. Doing so will make choosing the colours for your papers and embellishments so much easier. Okay, so I do now have my frames all backed in pattern paper, realigned and attached to the layout. I'm going to layer the filigree chipboard piece right on top right there, and then I'm going to add my photo on top of that. There are lots of layers here, so I am going to add a little bit of foam behind the photo. I want the photo to sit level. You may also have noticed that I've kept my photo print small, and that is tip number 4. Vintage photos can be pixelated and grainy, so when you're working with photos that are not of the best quality, it is best to keep the print of them very small. So back to the layout, I am going to start playing now with some embellishment pieces. I'm going to do my usual sweep through the die cuts that I have. All I'm doing at this point is seeking out pieces that I think could work. If I know they won't work, whether they be the wrong size or the wrong color, if I know they're not going to work, I will put them back into the bowl. Anything that could possibly work will stay on my desk. If you're new, you may not have heard me talk about this. I love to reduce my choices. I get decision fatigue. I don't like having too many choices to make. So I found that that's a really great way to limit the choices and really helps me to focus just on the elements that can work for the layout. Tip number 5 is to choose cream-based and warm color tones for your supplies. As I did my little sweep there, I actually eliminated anything that was blue or cool based. I just pulled out the mustards, the greens, and the soft pinks and yellows. I am breaking that rule a little bit with my white background, but the reason I chose that was because I'm wearing a white dress in the photo. Yes, that's a photo of me if you hadn't realized. Generally speaking, vintage photos match so much better with cream-based supplies. So I have started to fill up my frames here. I am going to run all of the embellishments horizontally across the page, and I'm going to try and contain them to that section where the frames are. The filigree chipboard piece is going to be the base of the main cluster, but I am going to add one on the left of the photo, and then I'm going to extend the cluster on the right all the way to the right edge. The lines for this design are very much left to right. I'm happy where the layout's going, so it's time to get serious. I'm gluing stuff down, starting with the photo, and then I will work largest elements to smallest. While I do that, I'll share tip number 6, and that is to never use original photographs. Always, always, always use scans and reprints of your originals. Tip number 7 is to try distressed edges. Whilst I have not done that for this layout, I personally prefer a cleaner look. I have seen many beautiful vintage scrapbook pages with those lovely distressed edges, and it does add to that mood and feel of the layout. Tip number 8 is to document what you can. Vintage photos can be tricky. We don't always know the full story behind them, but that shouldn't stop us from doing what we can. That could mean just talking about your memories of the photos. It could mean documenting how you received the photos or why they're in your possession. You could generally speak about the time in which the photos were taken, or you can reflect on them. What are your current thoughts and feelings about the photos when you look back at them? There are lots of different angles that you can take here. My tip is really just to do what you can and be okay with that. So as I've been chatting away, I've been moving through the embellishments, generally working largest embellishments to smallest, and I am really thinking about the balance of the colors on the page. Quite often I will choose an embellishment just because of the color that it is. It'll balance things out nicely. It may also be chosen because of its size or shape. I was super keen to nestle in and play with the shapes of things against that filigree piece. I'm also thinking a lot here about mixing the textures and balancing the textures on the page, but also replicating shapes. So the circle elements, for example, I want to make sure that the round pieces on the page have a nice balance to them. I am going to be adding my title for the page here in a moment, and it is Grateful, and it sort of comes back to what I was saying about reflecting on the photos. I was looking back at my childhood and just thinking about that and how grateful I am for the opportunities that I had as a young person. I will audition that here in a moment. I had actually forgotten about the chipboard sheet until this point in the layout. Luckily, there was a really small circle element that was mustard that I did pull from that, but I think that was all. I kind of left that too late. The other pieces will have to wait for another layout. One more tip to share with you, and that is to stay true to your own style. You don't need to change the way that you scrapbook fundamentally just because you're using older photos. You don't need vintage supplies. You don't need to change anything. You can simply scrapbook them the same way that you would scrapbook a photo from yesterday. For me, as long as I'm matching the color tones in a photo and the mood and feel of the picture, it all works out. So I just encourage you to do that. I do want to share with you some close-up images of the layout. There are so many pretty little details in this one. I'm really loving the dimension that was created with the chipboard as well. Be sure to also pop by Sue Plum's channel and see what she did with the two challenge pieces. Remember, they were vintage photos and chipboard pieces. Thank you so much for being here, my creative friends. If you like the way that I scrapbook or the way that I chat about the way that I scrapbook, I would love it if you give this video a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments if you have any other tips for working with vintage photos. I would love to hear them, and I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, bye!